last, my lunch. All right, you delicious hoagie, come to pop.
Nintendo is known for a lot of things. Fun platforms, adorable slice-of-life sim games, shooters involving cephalopods, you know, the usual stuff. However, the genre you don't generally turn to the big N for is horror. Sure, there are franchises like Fatal Frame or Eternal Darkness, that came out over 20 years ago, by the way. But when it comes to new horror, Nintendo doesn't really have anything first party, especially compared to its competitors. Besides, this is Nintendo we are talking about, the kid-friendly company that made Mario and Zelda. Them making a horror-themed first-party M-rated game will never happen. What? No build-up, just on a random Wednesday, Nintendo posted this 15-second teaser called Who is Emio, which showed a creepy dude wearing a paper bag with a smiling face on it. And that's it! Was that a horror teaser from Nintendo? It's age restricted? I wasn't the only one who was shocked, as apparently the entire internet went into a frenzy, wondering what it could all mean, and who the heck was this Emio guy? We all had to know. Well, we didn't have to wait long, as another trailer was unveiled 1 week later that gave us further clarification on Emio, and how it was not a new IP, but the return of a franchise that hadn't seen the light of day in over 30 years. Famicom Detective Club. While a lot of people were sad that this wasn't a new horror IP, and instead a continuation of a visual novel series, I was intrigued. 1, I really like visual novels, and I've covered them on the channel before. 2, the head of the project was Yoshi Sakamoto, the head guy for Metroid. And 3, regardless of what series it was from, it still promised an M-rated detective story. And that's just something Nintendo never does. They had laid the bait, and I grabbed it, hook, line, and sinker. So, was the game worth the hype? Is it as scary as Nintendo advertises? Or should Emio be hiding in a paper bag of shame? Let's find out. But before we do, what is Famicom Detective Club? While we had the Nintendo Entertainment System in the States, Japan called theirs the Famicom, short for Family Computer. It had some exclusive titles released only in Japan, including the Famicom Detective Club series, consisting of 2 visual novels about the Utsugi Detective Agency attempting to solve mysteries and interrogate witnesses. While the original never released in the States, it was very popular in Japan, being one of the first instances for the visual novel genre. Years later in 2021, both games, Famicom Detective Club: The Missing Heir and The Girl Who Stands Behind, were completely remade and modernized for the Nintendo Switch as digital exclusives, ready to be played by a new audience. I sadly never got to play these titles, but this franchise does have its fans, and it took these 30-year-old games and made them for the Switch audience. That's no easy feat, and fortunately for those fans, they didn't have to wait long for something new to sink their teeth into. Fast forward to 2024, the new Emio the Smiling Man game hits the scene, the latest entry in this long-standing franchise, showing new content for the first time in 3 decades. And it's got an M rating too. That alone makes me curious, but this story does involve a serial killer, so that checks out. And with that, I have to do a bit of a content warning with this game. This game delves into some dark topics, so this isn't going to be for everyone. So viewer discretion is advised. Also, we will not be going over any spoilers or anything detailed with the plot. I don't want to spoil this game for anyone playing it. And full transparency, Nintendo took down the stream where I showed the ending of the game, so let's not tempt fate, shall we? All that said, let's check out the game. The game stars a detective protagonist. I call him Rantective Bitective. Elementary, my dear viewers. So stupid. They work at the Utsugi Detective Agency. A boy named Ikusuke is found strangled to death, with a bag over his head, and it's up to the detective agency to solve the murder. You team up with your partner, Ayumi, in order to get to the bottom of the case, as Akusuke may not be the only victim, as this relates to the Smiling Man case that happened 18 years ago. This game comes with an interesting cast of characters that help you with the series of murders. There's Detective Kuzi, the strict workaholic. She's no nonsense, very hard on others, and kinda looks like Noah from Xenoblade Chronicles 3. There's Kuzi's partner, Detective Kamahara. He's a bit aloof and goofy, but he's good at what he does, so don't underestimate him. There's Inspector Kamada, the head of police and somebody who happened to work on the investigation 18 years prior. And so many more that I can't even get into at this point. I love the presentation here. Each character has a unique sprite, and they're animated too! Sure, it's simple stuff like waving their hands, but where visual novel entries rely solely on static images and poses to represent their characters, I really appreciate the extra effort put in here. It's also entirely voice acted too, not just a few lines or grunts. The entire game is performed with a top-tier voice cast, at least when it comes to Japan's voice actors. I kinda wish this got an English dub, but for what it is, each performance is well delivered and passionate. Each voice actor fits their characters perfectly, adding intrigue, and when the time is right, creepiness. Speaking of creepy, this is where we learn about our antagonist, Emio the Smiling Man.
Have you heard of Emio? You know, the Smiling Man?
He wears a trench coat and a paper bag on his head, with a creepy smile drawn on it.
He goes after crying young girls and promises them an eternal smile in exchange for their lives.
Some say if you see him, smile and laugh at him, he'll walk away. But if you stare at him directly in the eye, he kills you.
Emio was never found.
And is still out there to this very day.
To this very day.
To this very day.
You look sad, but you don't have to cry anymore. After all, I can give you a smile that will last forever.
The apparent murderer of yesteryear is back, striking again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. I have to applaud Nintendo for creating this antagonist and doing such a great job with it. His scenes are bone-chilling. Even talking about the guy gives me goosebumps. They do a fantastic job building up the suspense and tension. Each time he's mentioned, you get this sense of foreboding and fear. Oh man, terror when he actually shows up in the game. It's not an easy feat to make something scary, let alone a guy with a paper bag on his head. But they found a way with this story. He is very likely one of the darkest and scariest antagonists in Nintendo's long history of villains. Ugh. Gives me goosebumps every time I see him. The game is similar to your typical visual novel. Lots of exposition through reading with some minimal interaction here and there. You can do a series of commands. You can ask and listen, basically talking to the people around you. Look/examine, where it turns into an I Spy minigame looking for clues in the background. Call out/engage, where you can call out to anyone you see in the game or in the background. And think, basically your inner thoughts. Or in this case, an in-game hint command that points you to the right direction. I found myself using ask/listen a lot, because you'll be interrogating tons of folks. I appreciate having think available too, for when I get stuck from time to time. But I did do a lot of experimenting with different commands. There are a few times where you have to do commands in a specific order to progress the story. Figuring that order out is part of the fun. A lot of stuff is more useful than others. Like there's the call command, because you get a cell phone that looks like it's from the 90s, the ones that were basically as big as a computer. They are probably the most useless item, as you only need to call people a handful of times, or it just runs out of battery most chapters you play. And usually if you do call, it's for a funny line or an Easter egg or something. But with a dead battery, at least it's accurate for the phone at the time. You also get a handy dandy notebook to keep track of all the important characters you meet and everything you learn about them and the case. And it automatically updates with each chapter, so you can look back on it if you're ever confused or need to remember something. Be sure to pay attention, it'll be on the quiz later. No, seriously, the game reviews everything you learned at the end of each chapter, and it does give you multiple choice answers, so you can get them wrong. There's not a penalty if you do, so don't worry, but it's just a nice way to wrap up the end of each chapter, although it can get a bit repetitive at times. There really isn't much gameplay other than that. No mini-games, no gameplay sequences to break things up. The meat and potatoes is the story. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The story will have you visiting all sorts of locales, talking to all sorts of interesting people. There are even some places you'd never expect to go. I'm trying to be as vague as possible so I don't spoil anything, but trust me when I say this game has all sorts of unexpected twists and turns, and quite a few red herrings. You learn about each character, and just like their design, they are all interesting. There isn't a single character you talk to that doesn't make me wonder what would happen next, or what their story is. And oh god, the red herrings this game has for you. I spent the whole time theorizing what characters could possibly be the man with the bag. Is it the creepy teacher who runs super fast at us? Is it the aloof detective buddy cop that always quizzes us? Is it the older detective who's been at the case since the very beginning? Who is Emio, gosh dang it? It keeps you guessing at each character's motivation as you uncover the story throughout each part of the game. And while there are plenty of interesting characters to learn about and explore the backgrounds of, there's one character who, well, isn't. And that's the protagonist. He's not bad per se, but he is the typical named protagonist. Always optimistic, trying to find the motive on both sides of every issue, not the biggest character growth. It makes sense, though. He's not the focus of the story. It's not called Rantective the Content Detective, Famicom Detective Club. That's a lot of detectives. Our character is just a vessel to move the story forward. He still gets the job done by basically being our thoughts and mirroring how we process the investigation. Just noticeably blander than the rest of the characters. Thankfully, you can play as the other detective, Ayumi, and focus on the story from her perspective as well. Honestly, Ayumi is a lot more interesting. She has more of a backstory, there's history with one of the characters she interviews on multiple occasions, and it all makes for an intriguing story. I heard that both her and the protagonist have more fleshed out stories in the previous two games, but for people like me who've only played this one, it's still fine. On that note, you don't need to play the previous two games to enjoy this one. It's a self-contained story of that creepy bag-faced killer. Although you might miss out on a few apparent nods to the previous entries. I really enjoyed the story a lot, but there isn't much I can go into detail about without spoiling things. I guess I could talk about the horror element of the game. And for people who are anxious to play this because they fear it's like a typical horror game, honestly, it's not that bad throughout most of the adventure. It's less full-blown horror game and more solid detective storytelling with some horror and thriller elements thrown in. Throughout the majority of the game, you're learning about Emio and the murder case, and all the threads that relate to it. While the subject matter can be dark at times, talking about killings, murder, gruesome scenes, it's all done in a very conversational way. There aren't any moments where you're wandering around with a flashlight in the dark, waiting for some moldy monstrosity to come kill you. You won't have to rely on the very thin protection of a fake animatronic head to hopefully keep you from dying. What? I'm not talking about anything specific at all. Although, this game does attempt to jump scare you a time or two. Ah! Jesus Christ. In fact, things get a lot more sad than scary. The game isn't afraid to go down a few dark roads, and it can get emotional at points. I honestly love the realism a lot. It's one thing to tell a scary story, but it gets even more respect from me by being able to pull at my heartstrings. That's no easy feat, but Emio manages it with flying colors. A lot of the horror elements came from the titular character himself, the Smiling Man. Usually when he's mentioned, the lighting gets dark, the background becomes eerie, and the music takes on this bone-chilling tone. Oh god, the music whenever we even mention the Smiling Man is just so gosh dang terrifying. I tip my hat to the composer of this game. The variety of music really sets up the tone for every scene. Whether it's peaceful at the Utsugi station, a curious new area, a dark and creepy segment, or the surprisingly upbeat and groovy hit that plays when investigating people. The music moves and motivates you while you experience what this game has to offer. I can't give away too much, but there's a character that you interview in a certain location multiple times, and the music starts happy and cheery, but with every time you visit in that location, things just get sadder and sadder, including the music. Like I said, can't go into detail, but you'll see what I mean when you get there. And speaking of things I can't talk about, the ending, which I will not spoil, but I will give my thoughts on it as vaguely as possible. Sakamoto said in a trailer that the ending was divisive, and without giving anything away, yeah, I can see why. It's a heck of a ride. The game's M rating is extremely justified. I assure you, the ending was quite an adventure, and if you aren't satisfied with how it ends, the prologue should clear a lot of things up too. But again, I warn you, this is a very dark game. You're gonna have to be ready for it. Still, without going into detail, I found it to be great and a fitting conclusion to this amazing story. And that's all I have to say about that. Go play it yourself. Emio the Smiling Man was truly a wonderful surprise, and it's something I want to see Nintendo do more often. Like I said in the beginning of this review, Nintendo isn't known for doing scary games, but I really enjoyed what they did with this return to the Famicom Detective Club series. It's well written, looks amazing, has great atmospheric music, and is an overall fantastic thriller you don't see from the normally family-friendly company. It's getting me to want to play the other Famicom Detective Club games, and I hope they continue to add more titles to the series. However, if you aren't a fan of visual novels, this may not be the game for you. It's a lot of words and not a lot of gameplay, but if you want a fantastic story with an equal amount of horror ambience, it's a unique experience by Nintendo that you won't want to miss out on. Emio the Smiling Man, Famicom Detective Club, is sure to keep you smiling, however uncomfortably, the entire adventure.
After all, I can give you a smile that will last forever, ever, ever.
Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you like what you saw, be sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and check out my other videos too. Special thanks to all these people who helped me out with the video. I couldn't have done it without all of you. Also, an extra special thank you to my Patreon patrons, including Mantelferox and Savacom. You all help make these videos possible, and I truly appreciate you. If you'd like to join the Patreon, the link is in the description below, along with my Twitch and Instagram. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a good night.